Hi, welcome to the PathCast, your source of insight from global business and technology leaders, including tried and tested tips and tricks.
The PathCast is brought to you by RadioPath, an inbound marketing agency specializing in B2B tech and telecoms. For updates about the PathCast, check out our Instagram and Twitter at RadioPath. Hey everyone, I'm Tasman.
And I'm Taylor, and on the PathCast today we have Keynote speaker and futurist Shara Evans. Thanks for coming on the PathCast, Shara.
Oh, Taylor, Taz, great to talk to you this evening.
So Shara, your work brings together the latest technology innovations and cutting-edge research, tying them into strategic insights across industries. Do you want to kind of tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, sure. Well, right now I'm a technology futurist and keynote speaker, but I didn't start out my career in that place. I actually started a long time ago as a software engineer designing telecommunications industry protocols for carriers and vendors in the US initially, where I was born, and then all over the world, and ended up in Australia, where it was part of my sales and marketing territory. After a number of years, I ended up getting promoted out of the engineering ranks into program management, sales and marketing, and was working with Alcatel Australia out here for a few years. And I had a lot of carrier customers and was helping them to understand how this newfangled thing called data networking and what was to become the internet was going to impact their businesses. And they were saying to me, "Hey, Shara, you're actually providing us with better advice than the big management consulting firms are doing. Why don't you start up your own company, and we'd like to engage you as a consultant?" So I took that on board, and in 1997, I started my first company, which was called Telsite, and is actually still going now. It was purchased from me by a publicly listed company. I ran it for a few years under the public umbrella, and then decided to start another company back in 2006.
As you do.
So, yes, as you do. So I've been running my own businesses since 1997. So I've been a business owner and technologist, running tech analyst firms, and now keynote speaking in futurism for a long time.
Amazing. Just some points there. I can't believe you're not actually Australian.
Well, I'm a dual citizen, so I really am Australian. I have an Australian citizenship certificate that's more than 20 years old. So I'm definitely an Aussie, but I was born in America.
So interesting. And then just another point. So why, with your second company, did you kind of brand it with your personal branding instead of going a more traditional route as you did with Telsite?
Well, oh gosh, I did a bit of a pivot, 4 or 5 years ago into personal branding, but my second company is still going too. It's called Market Clarity. So it wasn't personal branding. And what I did with the second company was, rather than focus on prepackaged research reports, which was what I had done in Telsite, basically write the report and then try to sell it, I focused on designing all kinds of really interesting databases, and especially geospatial databases of infrastructure and SQL databases, and being able to help my clients by answering any question they might come up with hard data that's specific to their question, rather than prepackaged reports. And that was really new at the time. I think my company was the first in the world that assembled a geospatial database of not only telecommunications infrastructure of every variety that you can think of, but also electricity networks and roads and water, and meshed it with census data and all kinds of other business analytics data. And literally, it was there as a tool to help my customers with investment decisions, or to decide which telco provider was best suited to meet their needs based on the geography of where their offices were located. and answer all kinds of different questions,
So
really ad hoc.
today, data is obviously a huge part of any business, but at that time, what was kind of like the software like to allow you to manage all of that, and like how did you?
Well, at that time, when I was developing the GIS systems and SQL backend, I had a staff of 20 people working for me, and I had hired geospatial specialists and other people who helped me design the back end under my direction. I actually was the primary researcher digging out all the data on where all the networks were located and negotiating with carriers to get usually sensitive information and be able to put it into geospatial format. But it wasn't just me, it was me and a team of people.
Awesome.
Oh, and then, sorry, in terms of tools, we used a combination of some tools that we purchased, but a lot of open source and a lot of self development.
Is that something you kind of employ companies to do now? Not like employ, but direct them towards you should always use open source software if you can.
But I think it depends on the size of the company and what their mission is and what they're trying to accomplish. From where I was at back in 206, when I was designing the geospatial database, GIS software was hugely expensive, and this was something that I was playing with and just seeing if it would work. So I wasn't going to invest hundreds of thousands of dollars in software that I didn't know whether my idea of having a GIS database would even take off. So we went down the path of open source, and that turned out to work very well for us. But we also engaged data feeds from companies that allowed us to get street maps and other information. So we purchased information that we needed and integrated in with the systems that we designed.
Amazing. As a non-technical person, I'm so in awe of just the fact that people can just build things like that. I'm not sure which band it is, but I think maybe ACDC. One of the guys out of there programmed or like built the program they needed to produce the music because
Oh, really?
I don't quote me. I'm not sure if it was that band, but it was definitely kind of like a famous, like awesome rock band. And
Well,
it,
ACDC is definitely an Aussie, famous Aussie rock band.
but it's just amazing that you can kind of save yourself so much money as well, as you're saying. Try and build your own versions.
Well, that's one of the things you have to decide as a business owner is when do you build and when do you buy? And, a lot of it comes back to how much money do you have to spend?
I like that.
And,
Let's see the
also, have
money.
you, have you tested your business concept? And
Yeah.
open source is really great is when you want to test something out and you don't have a lot of money, then it's really good to be able to use free software to be able to test things. You know, um, you don't want to be spending a lot of money when you don't know if you have an idea that's going to work from a business perspective.
That makes
Definitely.
sense, definitely.
Um, Moving from that a little bit, kind of onto Shara Aaron's Futurist. Um, why did you make that move then again and kind of leave a more corporate structure to then go on?
Well, oh, look, there were a number of things that came into it. Personally, I'd been in the telco industry for a long, long time, and it was going to be much more mature and to me, as a technologist, less interesting than some of the newer technologies that the telco networks were enabling. But the other thing that was perhaps a real driver for me was the introduction of the national broadband network concept here in Australia.
Okay.
Initially in 2007, and we had various changes of governments and various plans for how the NBN was going to be rolled out. But the net impact on it was that it put the industry in stall mode for a number of years with respect to infrastructure investment. And a lot of my clients that I had designed these GIS databases for were carriers that were investing in infrastructure. So that was not necessarily a good thing for my business. And I thought, you know what, it's time to start thinking about what the impact of this MBN rollout is going to be on me personally and what I want to do with my business and what kind of new direction might I move in. And that's how I came to decide that continuing to run a tech analyst firm that was focused on a telco industry that was decreasing in size in relation to the number of players because they were merging with each other and was investing a lot less money in infrastructure and required less of my services. That wasn't really a great thing. But in the meantime, I had started to develop a track record over a very long period of years for calling the next big things and having my predictions come to fruition. And people were starting to call me a futurist. You know, I'd get introduced as, hey, Shara, she's a futurist. And I thought, you know what? Why don't I just take this to heart and actually move into the whole futurism space and go right back to my initial love of all kinds of technologies, not just very narrow telco industry, broaden back out again into the wider world of technology and med tech and genetic engineering and everything from artificial intelligence and driverless cars to robots and augmented reality and 3D printing and nanotech and material sciences and alternative energy and all sorts of really fun, cool stuff. And I decided, you know what? I think I'd really enjoy doing that. So that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I did.
Fair play. Going off of the futurist element, then, I wanted to ask you, so for someone whose career relies on being up to date with such a range of things, how would you say you stay in the loop?
Oh my gosh. I don't
I put you on the spot now.
know. I tend to work way too many hours. I have a hugely eclectic reading and podcast list of things that I touch base with.
Mm.
Uh, I also speak at a lot of events, so I'm at all kinds of different vertical industry conferences pretty much every week and listening to all kinds of other speakers in addition to just being on stage myself. So I meet a lot of really interesting people that way. And I'm also quite active on a few social media platforms, primarily LinkedIn because
Yeah.
it's professional, and to a lesser extent on Twitter. And I try to post things that people will think are interesting concepts or interesting ideas. And then I engage in conversations with people, and I get to meet a lot of people through social media from around the world. And people are pushing information out at me on a regular basis too. And in a lot of the conferences and events that I attend, there are also trade shows that are affiliated with the event. So I'll go around and talk to exhibitors and see things, or I'll read about an interesting project and I'll reach out to the scientists involved, no matter where they are in the world, and ask them for more information and do a video call, or if it's feasible, go into their labs. And basically, I'm just extremely curious and always asking questions and meeting a lot of new people. So it's a whole mix of things, really.
General lifestyle then,
Yeah,
seeing
definitely.
everything.
I was wondering as well if you could give any specific book recommendations for people in this space, and also podcasts as well that you would recommend people listening to,
Well, as I said,
as well as ours.
yeah, exactly. Well, you definitely have to listen to the two of you. But I get so many newsletters that it's crazy. And what I'll do is I'll just go through the newsletter and skim on the headline and the short description of whatever's in the newsletter
Mm.
and click on things that strike my fancy for one reason or another. It may be technology related, it may be business related, it may be environment related, or even political related. And sometimes one link leads me to another. But I couldn't say, oh, here's one newsletter that you absolutely have to have, because I subscribe to so many of them that it would be really hard. And I'm also, as I mentioned earlier, quite active on the LinkedIn platform, and people are, posting interesting information. I've got many thousands of connections,
Mm.
and I'll look at my feed, and if something looks interesting, I go to it. So it's really hard for me to say, do this one thing or listen to this one program and you'll get it.
This is the one nugget you need.
Yes.
Um, so we're just kind of like trying to establish some like actionable tips or tricks and that sort of thing. So you said before that you skim read through the newsletters. Is there like a particular process that you take for that? Do you look for keywords? Obviously you said already you look at the headline and the summary, but is there a particular interest you have right now, say like AI or like genetic engineering or anything that you look specifically for?
Yeah, so a lot of what I'm researching at any given moment depends on my upcoming keynote speeches. So in a couple of days, I'll be talking to an audience of radiographers and nurse counselors. And then a few days after that, I'll be talking to a group of accountants and business leaders. And then I'll be talking a few days after that to healthcare human resource practitioners. And then, the list goes on. My audiences are very varied. So as I'm skimming and looking for things, a lot of what goes on in my mind in the background of what is going to be relevant to the keynotes that I'll be working on over the coming months that I'm booked or proposed for. And aside from that, there are other keywords that I'm always looking at. All kinds of healthcare innovations are on my list of must read. All kinds of articles and deployments of AI in all of its many forms is a must read on my list. So AI could be anything from software that does pattern recognition or, big neural networks and deep learning, to robots and facial recognition and natural language processing. All of that will spark my interest. Um, Anything relating to 3D printing, augmented reality, virtual reality, cybersecurity, privacy, hacking,
And the list goes on.
alternative energy. And then I go into more, some of my personal interests like nutrition and ancient archaeology and
Oh,
things that have
interesting.
nothing to do with futurism, but that spiked my interest on a personal basis. One of my favorite things to do if I'm not on a stage is to go deep into the Amazon jungle and just get completely off grid and allow my mind to wander and invent things. And also traversing through ancient archaeological sites and imagining what life might have been like, thousands of years ago in different places.
How do you think those things influence your day-to-day work then? I imagine going off into the jungle and completely escaping everything is actually a little secret to creativity.
Absolutely. And when I do that, I'll go for 4 or 6 weeks at a time. So I can't always take that kind of big chunk of time, but that's my favorite thing to do, is to go off where I can go into deep meditation, contemplative state and really start thinking about the implications of all these different things that I read and talk about in my speeches, and extrapolate multiple scenarios of what the world will be like, where the pivot points are, what the black swans might be. By black swan, I mean unexpected events that could really turn
Yeah.
the course of humanity or the way that we use technology. What could go really right or really wrong that will be a pivot point, and start thinking about different timelines and how people will respond to different kinds of technologies, and things like what will happen when robots start to become really pervasive and people start to lose jobs. Right now, robots, most people think are pretty cool because they're a novelty. And I think very few people would have been made redundant because their job has been given to a robot. But what will happen in 10 years' time if instead of going for reskilling and redeploying people with new knowledge and new skills and repurposing them in their jobs, companies just start firing them, which I think would be the absolute wrong thing to do.
Mm.
But if that were to happen, then you could end up with this really quite dystopian scenario where you end up with a lot of unemployed people and a smaller subset of people who are employed and have a lot more money. And my mind wanders off into those
Yeah.
directions.
So, what would you say maybe to a company 5, 10 years down the line that can clearly benefit from doing that, from kind of getting rid of their workforce and letting robots do the jobs instead? Because most people would argue that that's more cost and resource efficient. So, what would you say to counterbalance that?
Um, the very first thing I'd say is if every company had that same attitude, who is going to buy your products? Because nobody will have a job.
That's
There we
really
go.
fair.
So, that gets people thinking. And then I say, wouldn't it be better to automate the parts of jobs that are the boring and repetitive bits and keep your people who know a lot about your industry and your customers and use their human creativity in ways that adds more value to your company and to your customers? That, to me, is the much better use of automation, where you're using it to do the things that people don't really like to do all that much anyway, but people are still employed, possibly doing a different task than what they might have done before, but they're using their creativity and valuable human intellect to help the business rather than just being cast off aside. Because if that sort of thing happens on a mass scale, then you start getting into this issue of should we have a basic living wage, or should there be a robot tax, and all these other things, which I think would be economic disasters because I don't think we'd have enough of a workforce to support that.
It was very interesting as well talking about AI because I remember listening to a podcast with Elon Musk on, and he actually said that he had warned people about AI, and just touching very similarly on what you were saying earlier about it.
Yeah, it's one of these technologies that I think can do tremendous good if deployed correctly
Yeah,
and keep humans in the loop with reinforcement learning so that the neural networks aren't just going off and doing their own thing in a black box manner where you've got no idea how the AI is making decisions, and you've got a whole bunch of massive big data as input that no single human could possibly go through all the inputs. And then you get outputs that may contain subtle human social biases and prejudices and all sorts of other things that you really don't want to be part of how you deal with your customers. But because it's just embedded in this big data, you don't even know it's there. So, this technique used in AI, which is called reinforcement learning,
mm.
I think is going to be extraordinarily important. And I'm calling the job that goes with that an AI trainer, where literally you're training the AI on what's good data, what's bad data, what reactions and outputs are the kinds of outputs that you want to get from that AI, or where it's made mistakes and steer it back on the right course. And I call it a job of the future, but funnily enough, my eldest nephew has actually just been employed as an AI trainer. Officially, his
Amazing.
title is data scientist, but he is in effect an AI trainer.
Cool.
Congratulations to him.
Yes, exactly. He actually really loves having an auntie as a futurist.
I can imagine.
Yes.
Well, IBM, I'm pretty sure they've got a model that kind of sets itself straight. I think it's like an upgraded version of Watson, and I read about it last year, but it can basically realize that it's being biased and then draw in data from somewhere else to kind of like counterbalance that, which is quite
Um,
interesting.
Not on its own.
Mm.
There are still humans involved in the loop. And in fact, one of the biggest problems, and it's not just IBM, it's for every AI company, is getting really, really good, high quality, clean databases to feed the AI. And I do not see in the foreseeable future where an AI is going to be able to self correct on things that it hasn't learned and been trained on by a human before. So if you've had a human in the loop with reinforcement learning, essentially weighting outputs, then you can recognize, an AI can recognize patterns of previous quote unquote bad behavior
Yeah.
and correct for those instances where it had gone wrong before. But if you've got new data that's coming in and it hasn't previously been flagged as incorrect, then I don't believe that any of today's AIs are capable of picking that up on for themselves.
Um, yeah, so obviously we kind of want to talk about business and like personal experiences, how you got to where you are. So, what did it kind of feel like when you realised that you being a futurist was kind of sustainable?
Well, it took a while to actually figure out what my next big thing was going to be. I knew that I needed to change my business, but I wasn't sure just, immediately exactly what I was going to do. So, one of the things that I did was I engaged a really great business coach that I got along with personally, and initially went to some seminars and then joined a mentorship group and a mastermind, one-on-one group. And it was through a combination of pulling out my own talents and ideas and things that I liked and interfacing with other business owners across a range of industries that I eventually came to the conclusion that becoming a full-time futurist was what I wanted to do. So that was part one. And then part two was deciding, okay, so you want to be a futurist and get involved with all kinds of interesting emerging technologies. You've got the right technical background for it. That's not an issue. But how do you go about commercializing it? Do you want to continue with a technology analyst firm that just looks at other technologies? Or do you want to do something different? And it was through asking myself those series of questions that it came to me that I actually really enjoy communicating with people about technology and have always enjoyed helping businesses to use technology for their benefit, to understand how it can help a lot of different vertical industries, and also to help individuals understand technologies, good and bad, on how they are impacted. And that's really how I came to the decision about keynote speaking. And then the next step was learning how to be a really great keynote speaker, because it's not something that you just sort of do unless you're trained or you practice,
Yeah.
to get up in front of hundreds or thousands of people. and not be looking at notes and have memorized everything in story format and have really cool graphics and really inform and entertain an audience at the same time. So it takes a lot of practice.
Do you have maybe three little nuggets of advice for someone that maybe has like an upcoming pitch, and how do they wow their audience?
Well, number one, so I'll say if you wanted to be a keynote speaker, as an example, the very first thing you need is a fantastic website. You also need a lot of really great video footage of you on stages, and you need a lot of customer reviews or testimonials, and preferably videos rather than just written. So if I were to take that and say, how does that apply to making a pitch? You would again want to make sure you've got really great collateral, that you really know what you're saying, that you've got good, solid referrals who can say, yes, this is a fantastic product. I've used it, love it, love working with whoever it is that's making the pitch. You want to have all the right ingredients there.
Mm.
Awesome. Has there ever been a topic where you felt maybe a bit overwhelmed, and out of your depth?
Oh, I think that's just part of the human condition, isn't it? If I said I never felt overwhelmed, I'd probably, you'd probably, you'd think she can't be telling the truth.
She's
Everybody
an
gets
AI.
overwhelmed from time to time. um, I suppose the thing that gets the most overwhelming as a solo business owner is not just doing the keynote speaking and research part. There's all the back end stuff that goes with running a business and all the financial stuff and tax stuff, and always learning new material because of the nature of my business as a futurist. And in my case, I customize every single speech that I do to a particular client brief, which is different than almost any speaker you'll run into. My speeches are highly customized and I memorize everything. So I use no notes, and I've got, a very quickly changing subject matter, technology, and um, very, very widely diverse vertical audiences. So it definitely keeps me on my toes.
So, are you blessed with a great memory, or how do you kind of cram yourself with all of that information?
Combination. I do have an excellent memory, which is genetic. Thank you, mom, dad, ancestors for that. But I use in my speeches graphics. I buy all kinds of really cool artwork, or unless I'm talking about a particular innovation, and then I'll show a picture of that innovation. And what I've trained myself to do is to associate all kinds of interesting tidbits with particular pictures. And that's what I use as my way of memorizing things.
I think that's a great technique to actually share kind of association with imagery. We've not had that so far, so.
Yeah, and it works really, really well because all I'll have to do is see a graphic, which could be a very cool graphic that I buy from an artwork company, and I'll just have, you know, interesting titling,
Yeah.
triangles that sort of fit in with my logo, and that's the only thing I'm going on. But that picture will trigger what I want to say about that subject for that particular vertical audience.
Awesome. So obviously you've already given us some advice about anybody looking to set up as a futurist, sort of like the website and so on. So what would you say to somebody in those very early stages? Would it be to go ahead and find yourself a mentor, or join sort of organisation?
Oh, absolutely. There are two kinds of mentors. There's formal and informal, and I've had both. And especially if you're going through a stage where you're looking to change industries or businesses. And you may do it as a non business owner where you just want to move out of whatever industry or career that you're in into a slightly different career. It's often very good to have an external person who is a trained business coach and facilitator help you pull out the ideas from inside of yourself on what you want to do and then help guide you through that transition period with really pragmatic advice about the best way of making any given transition. In terms of the speaking business, if someone wanted to be a keynote speaker, I would say you want to learn from other speakers. You might want to engage a speaking business coach, someone who's really, really good and is a professional speaker themselves. So they're not just telling you what to do, they've done it and can prove it. And they have a system and they know what it takes to get bookings and how to position yourself to get the right profile. In my case, because I've been running tech analyst firms for several decades now, I have a very high media profile, which is a fantastic thing to have as a keynote speaker. So I'm on TV on a fairly regular basis. I do podcasts like yours. I do, you know, things in all different parts of the world. And that's part of how people get to hear about me. So you need to do the right things and make the right investments to make your new business venture a success.
Sure. I wanted to ask you just after just everything that you've said so far, and I think you touched upon it earlier, but what you know you do all of these amazing things, and you're very active, and you're clearly very passionate about tech and just the advancement that's going to have on human life. And I just wanted to ask you, but what actually drives you to do what you do?
Well, there are a lot of things, but at the very, very core is that I care about the future of humanity.
Oh my God, that's
And
beautiful.
that's really the core of everything that I do.
Yeah.
And I also know that the future is not fixed, it's what we make it.
Mm.
And I want to do my part to show all kinds of people and companies how technology can help them, but also alert them to areas that could be problematic so that we don't end up with a dystopian society.
Yeah.
Because I think if we can see that something could be a problem on the radar, then we can navigate around it. If we don't see it as something that could happen, then we're more likely to make it happen by mistake.
Yeah, I think that's very beautifully answered. And just, I mean, it's definitely come across. But would you say you do genuinely just love tech?
Oh, of course. I've been into tech since before I knew how to read. I was interested in all sorts of things, even as a little girl. But I think that's probably the key to my success in business is that I've always worked in areas where I can get excited about what I do and I really enjoy it. And I enjoy being around people and knowing that I can help companies or individual makes me feel happy and makes me feel good. So that's important to me.
I think one thing that you touched on earlier that I think is very profound is the fact that it's you care about companies trying to understand the moral consequences of tech and just being aware of that and how to implement that correctly. Do you think that that's very, very important for the future of humanity at the moment?
Oh, hugely. If you look at any of my writings or listen to any of my speeches, you'll pick up very quickly that I'm a privacy advocate
Mm.
and also a cybersecurity expert. And I've already seen things that have gone really wrong. And I can see where some of the technologies that we're deploying now could go even more wrong in the future.
Yeah,
And I think it's very important for people to understand the implications of how much information they put out in public and how that information is used and in some cases abused.
Mm.
And even though we have these new things, digital home assistants coming out and voice interfaces on our phones and all kinds of applications, most people don't know that these devices are always on and always listening. And the business model from some of the companies that make these gadgets available for free or minimal cost is to take your information and sell it to third parties.
Mm.
So, the word I would say is be aware of how much information you're putting out there. Be aware of the kinds of gadgets that you're using. Be aware of what your privacy settings are. For heaven's sakes, don't do something silly like put your birth date on a website, you know? Don't put your home address on a website. Don't do things that could lead to identity theft
Mm.
or worse.
Just looking at those ethical considerations, what would you say to a startup kind of exploring a new area of tech that could potentially have negative impacts that they haven't actually considered from the outset? So, what are like three questions that you would maybe tell every startup to ask themselves in regards to ethical considerations?
Okay, well, one of the things I would say is when it comes to data collection, think very carefully about what you're collecting and why. So, do you really need to know somebody's birth date or driver's license number? So, I've recently been to hotels where, I'll check in and they'll want to see my driver's license to verify who I am. That's okay. And then I say to them, "Did you scan that?" And they say, "Yes." And I said, "Delete it right now. You have no need to have my driver's license in your records. I'm a cybersecurity expert and I do not want you to have that in your database." And you also, so that's just one, silly example, but it happens all the time.
Yeah.
Also think about how and where you're storing the data that you collect. Who has access to it? And what will you do if there is a data breach? And understand that penalties can be very large in different parts of the world, and especially if you have any data on EU citizens. I know that might be a sore topic in the UK right now, being in
It
but
never won't
under
be a sole topic.
yeah, under GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, if you have a data breach and you have data about an EU citizen that is impacted by that breach, then even though you might be a company sitting here in Australia, that legislation applies to you and you could face massive fines of the greater of, I think it's 20 million euros or 4% of your global revenue.
Damn.
Yes. That's a lot of money, and no matter where you're at in the world, somewhere in your database of customers, you might have dual citizens or people that are EU citizens that GDPR legislation then applies to you no matter where you are in the world. I also see companies doing really dumb things, especially in the healthcare segment, where they'll send you an email and ask you to provide information like your birth date and Medicare number or all sorts of other things that are usually confidential over email. And they've got no clue that email is not at all secure. You might as well just post it on a website.
Sure. Sort of speaking of cybersecurity, actually, and government surveillance and sort of dystopia again, within Australia there have been some changes in cybersecurity and government surveillance. Could you tell us a little bit about this and how it's impacting telecoms?
Well, one of the first changes started back a number of years ago. I think it's probably 4 or 5 years ago now, with the enactment of what they're calling the data retention regime.
Mm.
So prior to this, telcos and ISPs had a lot of different systems that might have bits and pieces of customer data, but they weren't necessarily keeping that information for any long period of time. And they certainly were not aggregating it into a single database. When this law was passed, it forced every telco and ISP in the country to literally consolidate all of the databases that they had so that there was a single record of all the things pertaining to a given individual's communications, metadata, not the actual voice conversation, but all the metadata around every phone call that you make, every text that you send, every website that you visit, anything and everything all in one place and store it for 2 years. And that was a very expensive exercise, and the government only partially funded it, and it's part of the law. So if you're a telco or ISP out here, you have to do it. Just today, I was skimming through one of my newsletters when I saw that one of the state police agencies is petitioning or agitating, I should say, to have metadata now stored for 7 years
Oh,
instead of
wow.
2 years.
Interesting.
And that has a massive cost impact for the telcos, large and small, that have to store and aggregate this data. Not only that, but if you think about it from a cybercrime perspective, what this law has done is in effect create honeypots sitting on the premises or cloud network of every single telco and ISP in Australia that have all kinds of really juicy data about every citizen and company in the country. So it's not
Yeah.
just individuals, it's business information too. So businesses need to be concerned about that. And there, the initial thrust behind this was, well, if there's a terrorist attack or something horrible happens,
Hmm.
we need to have all this metadata so that we can track back through their communications. But I think the reality is that in most cases, unless they're really dumb terrorists, they're probably not going to be using mainstream messaging services. Are going to be on the dark web somewhere or be
Yeah.
using really strong encryption, and that the people that would end up getting hurt by this are your normal law-abiding citizens and companies, and not the actual, real bad guys. And then there's scope creep too that's also happened, where initially this legislation was meant to be used only for really serious crimes like terrorism, but then all kinds of other government agencies were petitioning to get access to this data on a warrantless basis for things like the Racing Commission or WorkSafe or other things that, yes, they might have a legitimate reason to want access, but I say due process is required and prove to a judge that you need access, and then through the normal procedures for accessing data on telecom networks, then you can get access to the data, but that you shouldn't be able to get access on a warrantless basis.
So,
So that's
how?
just one of the things. There's so much going on here. This could be a very long conversation. That's just the tip of the iceberg on, where things started to go, what I would call a bit astray here down
Hmm.
under. And there's been some recent moves by the government, including a bill that was passed last minute right before Christmas last year, where the government would really like to block encryption and open up backdoors on all kinds of global communications networks and devices, which is again silly if you think about it.
Yeah.
Here in Australia, yes, we're an English speaking country. We're allied with the US and the UK, but are global tech giants going to put in a backdoor into their devices just because there's a law in Australia that says you should have to if a law enforcement agency in Australia asked you to do it. I think probably not.
Yeah.
They won't even do it when the US ask them, so
Yeah, exactly. And not only that, but backdoors are dangerous. If
of
you've got a
course.
backdoor in an encrypted service, and especially if it's known that there's a backdoor, it's not just the government that can get into it. You can't just say backdoor access for government, you know, access only. The hackers will get to it too. You know, there's just, it's not mathematically possible to do a backdoor just for government agencies. And the government has not taken advice from cybersecurity experts, from mathematicians, from physicists, from anybody else that actually knows what they're talking about. They've just sort of plodded on and done their own thing.
So, what advice would you give to a business leader to deal with this?
I would still say use the strongest possible encryption for all of your communications. Be aware that email, while it's a great tool, is not a secure method of sending confidential information unless you are encrypting it. Most people do not realize that email is not secure, but
Yeah,
it's not.
especially Gmail.
Well, yeah, because you're sharing it with a company, in that case, that has a business model of selling information.
Yeah.
I think there's an old proverb or an old saying, there is no such thing as a free lunch. Somebody
Yeah.
Yeah,
always has to pay. And what you're paying for are these wonderful services, but you're paying with information about yourself or your company.
How would you like to be remembered?
Oh, let me have to think about this one for a moment. I'd like to be remembered as someone who truly cared about the future of humanity and did her very best as an individual to steer us into a utopian future.
That's awesome.
fantastic.
I support you in that 100%.
Thank you.
We've got
And
little Shara Evans flags over here.
yeah, I'm waving it now. It's actually been an
Yeah.
absolute pleasure to speak to you, Shara, and I've learned a lot. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity as well to give yourself a bit of a plug. Where can people follow
Sure.
you and all that jazz?
The best place to find me is on my website, sharaevans.com. I have a future tech blog where I write articles about things that interest me. I also have lots and lots of keynote speeches and video blogs that I film for clients and just because I want to, and TV interviews and podcasts and other things that people may find really interesting. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and if you just type in Shara Evans, I'm sure you'll find me and you can follow me or connect with me there. I'm on Twitter. I'd welcome people to connect with me on social media, to subscribe to my newsletter, which the link is on my blog page on my website. Think a little bit about the future and the interesting technologies that are on our near and longer term horizon.
It's perfect.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shara.
Thanks for listening to the PathCast.
If you've liked this episode, pass it on to your friends and colleagues and share the wisdom.
Tag us on social media at Radio Path with any questions or ideas you might have from what you've heard today.
And don't forget to give us all of the 5-star ratings and subscribe.